Hey, Dwayne, come on, unmute yourself.
Okay, ready?
Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Heritage Talks Online, brought to you by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. My name is Dwayne Wilkin, and I'm here with Alison Kirkwood and Glenn Patterson to bring you the first of this year's talks, the remarkable story of Harriet Brooks, groundbreaking scientist and Montrealer, whom today's guest speaker has dubbed Canada's first nuclear physicist. Before I introduce Geoff, just a few words about our network for those who may be joining us for the first time. We are a nonprofit association dedicated to history learning in Quebec with a focus on English-speaking communities. Our supporting members include historical societies, community museums, archives, public libraries, and cultural organizations across the province, as well as individual subscribers who receive our quarterly magazine, Quebec Heritage News. Quebec Heritage News is the only English language publication of its kind in Quebec, featuring stories about people, places, and events from the past you won't find in standard history textbooks. Figures like Harriet Brooks. You can find more information about Quan and the work we do on our website, www.qahn.org. And please consider joining with a paid subscription. Our members help ensure that we can continue to offer free public lectures. In return, we'll keep you in the know about upcoming talks, conferences, exhibitions, interesting workshops, and special publications. Today is a great day to join because Quan is offering first-time members a 30% discount off the usual price of a one-year membership. That's just $20 for 4 issues of Quebec Heritage News. Message me or Allison in the Zoom chat box or by Facebook Messenger to claim this offer, which is valid only until the end of today's live video lecture. Finally, I would like to thank our major sponsors who also make this series possible: the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Zeller Family Foundation, and Townshippers Foundation. Please note all our presentations are recorded and made available for viewing on Quan's Facebook page as well. This is a public site, so you don't need to have a Facebook account to access any of our past talks. A final word about technology. I would encourage those of you on the Zoom call to please turn off your webcam while Geoff is presenting his talk. This is to help minimize transmission problems for viewers in regions with limited internet. You're welcome to turn your webcam back on for our question and answer period immediately following the presentation. Indeed, I encourage you to. Speaking of which, I invite those of you who joined by Zoom to click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen if you have a question for our speaker or a comment you would like to share aloud. You can also write your questions and comments in the Zoom chat box or on Facebook Messenger. Now, I am very pleased to welcome Geoff Rayner-Canham as our guest this afternoon. Geoff spent many decades teaching chemistry at the Grenville campus of Memorial University in Corner Brook, Newfoundland. How he came to become a science historian is a tale in itself, which I will leave for him to tell. Suffice to say that back in the 90s, he and his partner, Marelene Rayner-Canham, were intrigued by certain references to H. Brooks they kept coming across in old research publications. Their curiosity developed into a bit of an obsession, which Geoff has likened to detective work, piecing together clues from disparate sources. Their biography of Harriet Brooks was published in 1992, launching what has since become their main area of research, writing about the lives and contributions of forgotten women scientists. Their most recent book, Pioneers of the London School of Medicine for Women, was published earlier this year. Welcome to Heritage Talks Online, Geoff. Over to you.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I'll now share my screen. Okay, so unfortunately, my co-researcher unable to participate this afternoon. Marlene's the #1 archivist. She goes bowing around archives and combing through all sorts of miscellanea in search for whatever we need, and many of the things we didn't even know we needed. So I'll start with give a little bit of background. So many of you probably have heard of Marie Curie, and some of you, the elder daughter, Irene Curie, who also went on to become a nuclear scientist. And a few of you will have heard of Lise Meitner, who never got her recognition. She should have gotten shed in a Nobel Prize, but her co-researcher Otto Hahn wrote her out of the story. So how do we get into this in the very first place? So I was reading a book called The Discovery of the Chemical Elements by Weeks and Lester, and there were all these photographs of aged white men, usually with beards, and then in among it was this cameo portrait of a Harriet Brooks. Never heard of her, and we couldn't find any account of her life or work. We searched and searched, and we decided we would work one summer, and we were sure that the summer would be enough to find out everything there was about Harriet Brooks. How wrong we were. So we started off obituaries from the McGill University archives. That was the easy one. We found letters in Rutherford's archives in Cambridge that he had written to her and letters that she had written to him. Letters at Barnard College in New York. What was she doing there? Letter in Curie archives. What's the connection to the Curie archives in Paris? Material in the Gorky Museum in Moscow? What on earth was that doing there? And we were able to get in contact with Paul Brooks Pitcher, her surviving son, and he sent us her note case, which he'd still kept decades later. And there was photographs and all sorts of odds and ends and a few letters. And then subsequently, when we maintained our correspondence with him, he said, would we like to see his mother's love letters that she received? We said, oh, yes, please. And he put them in the regular mail. And he said that we were panic-stricken that they'd get lost en route, but they never did. So this was the starting point. And it's from this, and as Dwayne mentioned, it was just like real live detective work, trying to put together the story of her life and contributions. So, first of all, she was born actually in Exeter, Ontario in 1876. And here's the family picture. And there is Harriet, the one on the right there. But she went to McGill, or the Victoria College, the Women's College of McGill University. And this is the elementary physics lab at the time that she was there. And here's the picture of her, which has become the standard portrait. And she got a BA honors in math. They didn't have BScs in those days, they were all BAs. And it was in math and natural philosophy. And natural philosophy was any of the physical sciences like physics and chemistry, but she focused on the physics. This is where coincidence comes in, that at that time, the McDonald Tobacco Company donated enough money to McGill University to build a state-of-the-art physics building. I only wish they did that sort of thing these days, instead of some of the pursuits that the companies spend money on. So this is the physics building. This was absolutely state-of-the-art, top-notch, one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. And this attracted Ernest Rutherford, who was at Cambridge, and he came over to Canada, to Montreal, to work in this building. And he arrived at the same time that Harriet Brooks was looking to do graduate work. And in fact, she finished up doing an MA with him, researching in his laboratory. And this is a diagram from one of their publications, The New Gas from Radium, probably the most famous piece of work that she did. And it shows that diagram. And if you go to the museum at McGill University, you will find this, the exact same piece of equipment that Brooks used way back 120 years ago. They can actually go and sit. And Dwayne actually used it, a color version, in the poster which he'd circulated. Now, she got written out of the story, even recently, and it's known as the Matilda effect. There was previously a Matthew effect. The Matthew effect which was in the Bible, to him that hath shall be given, from him that hath not shall be taken away. But it was even more pronounced in the case of women. And Matilda Gage, the written out feminist suffragette in New York, had her name attached to the Matilda effect, the way that the junior women researchers got written out a story even more than junior male. So we had to contradict this, so we wrote a reply that no, he wasn't the true discoverer of radon. If you looked at the original publication, it was by E. Rutherford and Miss H.T. Brooks, and the new gas from radium, what we now call radon. Then she went to Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania, and she commenced a PhD in physics. And this is the engraving of Bryn Mawr College at the time. And this is M. Carey Thomas, the redoubtable president of the Bryn Mawr College. And she made the famous comment, Bryn Mawr women would not be prepared for marriage, but for careers in which they would excel. And so Harriet Brooks started there, but she was only there a short while, and she was awarded the President's European Fellowship. At that time, the most prominent researcher apart from Rutherford was J.J. Thompson at Cambridge. So she went and started research with J.J. Thompson. Now, the Women's College, there were two, Girton and Newton. Newton was the science one, and you notice it's out in the middle of the fields because they didn't want females to contaminate the male atmosphere of Cambridge University of the time. So she had a long trek in to get to the labs on the Cambridge University main campus. And this was J.J. Thompson. And it goes to show the importance of the supervisor, because Rutherford had a reputation of being affable, amenable, chatty, in fact, gossipy. Gossipy is perhaps a very good word for him if you read it, go through his letters in his archives. But J.J. Thompson was dour, uncommunicative, really wasn't into this radioactivity stuff at all, and believed that there was some chemical explanation for it. So the thing that kept Brooks going was her correspondence back with Rutherford at McGill. And this is a comment from her. So she wrote, I'm afraid I'm a total bungler in research work. This is so extremely interesting, and I'm getting along so slowly and so blunderingly with it. I think I shall have to give it up after this year. There's so many other people who can do so much better and in so much less time. I do not think my small efforts will ever be missed. Now, this is characteristic of what's called the imposter syndrome. And a good description was given. There can be very talented women at the top of their classes who still feel their male counterparts are much smarter, and at any moment someone's going to reveal how stupid and incompetent they really are. It's very clear that throughout her working life, Harriet Brooks felt the imposter syndrome. She had decided that she'd better come back with Ernest Rutherford, who welcomed her back. And there's Harriet Brooks on a snowy day outside the physics building, and there is Ernest Rutherford. So she resumed research with Ernest Rutherford, and again made some significant discoveries. And in particular, she observed the volatility of radioactive substances. And here's the publication in Nature, just a note, I just clipped the bits of it. In the course of some recent experiments, which went to the conclusion that emanation X of radium undergoes after being deposited on solid body, slightly volatile even at ordinary temperatures. Written by Harriet Brooks, McGill University. And this is actually one of the problems, because Harriet Brooks was an unknown person when the conventional researchers were looking at the history of radioactivity, they never looked for her. They saw Ernest Rutherford's work and J.D. Thompson's, but who would look for Harriet Brooks? Now, this was her second most important work. This is atomic recoil, that when an atom breaks apart, just like the momentum of any two bodies, just as the particle goes off in one direction, the remaining nucleus hurtles off in the other, and sometimes expelled from the body in the solid and can be captured on another surface. And if you read Wikipedia's atomic recoil, it says atomic recoil was discovered by Harriet Brooks, Canada's first female nuclear physicist in 1904, but interpreted wrongly. Otto Hahn reworked and explained and demonstrated it in 1908. The physicist Walter Gerlach described radioactive recoil as a profoundly significant discovery in physics with far-reaching consequences. Now, Otto Hahn, and if you remember, Otto Hahn stole Lise Meitner's work, as I mentioned way back in the second slide, that he claimed total discovery of atomic recoil, and Rutherford corrected him on this in a letter to Hahn. By the way, I thought I had the idea of the removal of atoms by recoil in my radioactivity. That was his book. Somewhere, see page 392, second edition, is giving an explanation of the volatility of radium B observed by Miss Brooks. So he gives Brooks credit for having observed the first concept of radioactive recoil. And but after that, Harriet Brooks went off to Barnard College, and she was appointed tutor in physics. Now, while she was there, she got engaged to Dr. Bergen Davis of Columbia University, which is the men's university associated with the Barnard Women's College. He seems he used to have his lunch that he wanted pictures brought over her order sheet. He would stamp on it, milk and cookies, bring at once. However, it didn't go down well with the dean at Barnard College, and she demanded the resignation of Harriet Brooks. And Brooks replied, "I think also it is my duty I owe to my profession and to my sex to show that a woman has a right to the practice of her profession and cannot be condemned to abandon it merely because she marries." The head of physics also intervened and writes to Dean, "Neither you nor I would like to give up our active professional lives suddenly for domestic life. I know of no woman to take her place, no one available as the preparation and the personality and the abilities to teach and the skill in physical manipulation that she has." The dean was unmoved. The college cannot afford to have women on the staff to whom the college work is secondary. The college is not willing to stamp with approval a woman to whom self-elected home duties can be secondary. Even though that Brooks subsequently broke off the engagement, probably wisely, that she decided to leave Barnard feeling that the dean was hostile to her. And this leads her life in a different direction. She moved to Summerbrook in New Hampshire, and Marelene and I were actually able to visit the house, and the owners actually had a photograph which showed Harriet Brooks and Prestonia Man Martin, the owner, sitting by the fire. So there's Harriet Brooks and there's Prestonia Martin. Now, there were other people staying at Summerbrook at the time. Maxim Gorky and the second woman in his life, Maria Fyodorovna Andreeva, and also Maxim Gorky's secretary, Nikolai Burenin. Now, what were all these people doing at Summerbrook? Prestonia Martin was a great believer in going back to nature. And this was one of these utopian communities. And here's a picture of them, manual labor in the fields, and everything had to be done personally. There were no maids, there was no assistants. This was a back to nature utopian community. Although I suspect, although I've got no direct evidence, that Gorky was there not so much because of the utopia, but more to escape the news reporters in New York City. Brooks traveled with them across to Italy. And there's Harriet Brooks on the deck of the Princess Irene on the way to Naples. And it even made the New York newspapers, one saying that Maxim Gorky and his mistress, plus some unidentified woman, were on the ship leaving for Italy. And this was what we found in Harriet Brooks's note case, a whole lot of pictures taken on the island of Capri, where they set up camp. And there is Harriet Brooks, and there's Nikolai Brenin. And according to her surviving son, that there's a rumor that carried down through the family that there was certainly a strong friendship between that Brenin had actually proposed marriage to Brooks. And in the Gorky Museum in Moscow, in the archives, there was this picture of Harriet Brooks. Well, she didn't stay there too long. Maybe it was when Gorky and Brenin went back to Moscow, but she then moved to Paris and to institute a radium to work with Marie Curie. And one thing that people don't realize, what people don't realize was that Curie might have been a sole researcher in the early years, but after she became famous, lots and lots of women researchers joined her group. And this is an actual book called The Women of the Marie Curie Laboratory. And there were about 30-something of them. And she had very little interaction with Marie Curie. She was given lab space, and she worked with a couple of other people, Mademoiselle Blanquise, and a few others, and Gleditsch from Norway. But she said she had, in her letters back to Rutherford, very little interaction with Marie Curie. So this was not a very hospitable place for her. And Rutherford realized this. So he had invited her to work with him at the University of Manchester. He'd left Canada because he felt it was a backwater at the time, beautiful building, but he was out of the mainstream. And he managed to get a fellowship for Harriet Brooks to come and join him. And this was all set up. And then Brooks sent Rutherford a letter. And Rutherford passed on to say he was a great gossip to his colleague at Manchester, to Arthur Schuster. Miss Brooks has just informed me she's engaged to be married to Mr. Pitcher of Montreal, formerly one of my demonstrators. He's an old and persistent admirer and has come over to England for the purpose of persuading her to go back with him. They're to be married next month. And this was all this bunch of love letters was from Frank Pitcher to Harriet Brooks. And they had all sorts of things like, what would you do? That there aren't jobs out there for women in science, and we'll go back to Montreal, have a great life together. And so she decided she would marry him, but before they did, he decided he wanted to go and tour Europe on his own. And there's a whole bunch of postcards in this collection that he sent back to Harriet Brooks, saying what a wonderful time he was touring Europe. Some of them a little bit poor taste. For example, Harry is in Switzerland and how pretty the waitresses were in the restaurant. Not the sort of thing you really would want to send to your fiancée. So Harriet Brooks had decisions to make. And why did she decide to quit? Well, first of all, was lack of self-confidence and the lack of academic opportunities, because women at that time simply could not get academic positions. If they worked in a lab, They did it for free, and it was a dead-end position. And as Pitcher pointed out to her, the only other alternative was to become a school teacher, and that was dead-end too. Mary Rutherford, there was letters from Mary Rutherford to Harriet Brooks, and basically saying, why don't you go and settle down? You've had wonderful travels. It's time to settle down. And Frank Pitcher sounds is a good catch. Prestonia Man Martin, she was an anti-suffragist. She believed women should not have the right to vote because they were too flighty and couldn't make the right decisions. She also believed that smart women had to have children because she was one of these eugenicists who argued that if you had smart women and had children, they would be very smart children, and they would serve to raise the IQ of the human race. And then finally, Frank Pitcher badgering her with letters over about a 3 or 4 year period. So it was pretty much that it came from all directions. We'll never know the truth. We'll never know exactly what transpired. So here's the family picture. And she had 2 sons and a daughter. The elder son died of spinal meningitis. The daughter committed suicide. She was a student at McGill University at the time. And the little boy at the bottom was Paul Brooks Pitcher, who we met in later life. So here in Montreal Cemetery is the family tombstone. And so it's the husband, Harriet, the daughter, the 2 sons, and the wife of Paul Brooks. So we put this all together, and there's a story behind that. We don't have time today. And this is published, and it became a big hit in Japan. It's sort of like a scientific equivalent, a true story of an Anne of Green Gables sort of story. But we found so many other women mentioned, particularly in Brotherhood's gossipy correspondence, Maceable Leslie and in Gleditch. And so we finished up researching and writing a book on the other pioneer women we discovered. And from then, it just grew and grew and grew. We found hundreds of forgotten women, and we've done our best in the different books and articles to bring them to life. And that was in the past, but coming more to the present, that this was made it nationally. And here's Marelene and Robin Brooks Pitcher, son of Paul Brooks Pitcher, where she was inducted, Harriet Brooks was inducted into the Canadian Science and Technology Hall of Fame. And there was even more recognition. The 2015 issue of the Canadian Journal of Physics has Harriet Brooks on the cover, Discoverer of Radon. And if you go on the website for the 250 greatest Canadians, 244 is Harriet Brooks. And finally, someone suggested her for the $100 bill when we went over to a plastic currency. And I don't know who did this. There's no attribution we could find, but it's rather interesting. This was shared even with Maclean's. Maclean's came and mentioned that. And yet more, the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories in 2016 dedicated their new building as the Harriet Brooks Building, and there's a Harriet Brooks Award for women in the industry. So with that, I hope I've given you a taste for the life of Harriet Brooks, the very varied story, the interaction with Maxim Gorky, working with the other famous physicists of the time, and then how she gave up. Probably they really, she could, even if she had taken up the fellowship with Rutherford, she could have continued on with him, but she would never have attained fame in her own right. So I thank you so much for listening.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Geoff. That was wonderful. What a wonderful introduction to a woman from history most of us probably have never heard of. Certainly not I. I wonder if I could just ask everybody who would like to put some questions to Geoff to turn their cameras back on. We'll play it dangerously here now. See, we can get everybody up. And as I said earlier, if you have a question, I'll try to pick you out based on the hand raising icon, which you can find at the bottom of your screen under a button called reactions. I think if you click on that once, then you can raise your hand, and I'll try to keep order of who's asking. But I have a couple of questions to start off with, if I may. You talked a lot about her work with Ernest Rutherford, and I know a little bit about Rutherford's fame at McGill and later, but could you go into a little bit more detail about the time, about that period in science? We're really talking about an era where physics is beginning to gain prominence among the sciences. Different theories are being put forward. I mean, Einstein himself has just published major papers. I think his big papers were his first big papers were in 1905, so a year or so before the work the paper that Harriet and Rutherford wrote, and for which she did not get credit. Could you paint a quick picture of that period for us and what was going on?
Yeah. Sure. It was a period of a great deal of uncertainty. And in particular, this idea that there's stuff coming off radioactive materials. And was it a dust? Was it a vapor? Was it a gas? This was one of the real prime questions of the time. But it was a real period of uncertainty where people didn't understand what was going on. No one had any fundamental idea. They could make measurements, but it was the work with Brooks that identified this was actually a gas that could be studied and determine the atomic weight of. But you're right. It was a group of people who were floundering, and J.J. Thompson was convinced this was all chemical. He was never a great fan for the work that Brooks was doing. That was one of the reasons why it was so unfortunate she worked with him and lost her even more of a self-confidence. Does that sort of answer your question, Dwayne?
Yeah, and it leads into a sort of secondary question. You had a couple of interesting terms that you referred to in your talk, and one of them was this syndrome you call the I think it was called the Matilda. Is it the Matilda syndrome of some kind?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain that a little bit further? I'm not sure if I followed that exactly. This is a reference to a scientist, a female scientist of another whose career has also been studied and who was effectively written out of history by her male colleagues.
Yeah. So the original one that was written up in the literature was called the Matthew effect. That when there was two discoverers of something, then the one who was famous got all the credit, and the one who was lesser known got written out of the story. And they chose the term Matthew effect because of after the biblical quotation, "To him that hath shall be given, to him that hath not shall be taken away." Mm-hmm. And so that was very appropriate. But what they then subsequently found, this was work by Margaret Rossiter, was that if it was a woman who was the secondary author, that was far more prevalent, and she was usually totally written out of the whole discussion, any mention whatsoever. This is something Marelene and I have found in a lot of our research, that is always attributed to the famous male researcher, and there'd be a footnote or maybe no mention at all that work was actually done by a junior woman researcher, often working for free in the laboratory. It was named after Matilda Gage, who was a New York pioneer suffragist, but she was written out of history because she was African American, and this did not fit in with the idea at the times that the suffrage movement was essentially a white middle class movement, and so that's how that got transferred. So that's where the Matilda came from.
Thank you. You didn't touch on much of her early life, so I wonder if I could ask you, do we know much about how she came to McGill in the first place? I don't believe she was born in Quebec, but she was born next door in Ontario.
Yeah.
How did she get to McGill? Was she from
the family moved? The time limitations, as the saying goes, you'll have to read the book.
Yes.
But the family actually moved to Montreal. The father was a flower salesman, among many things, and moved the family to Montreal. And the advantage of McGill was that at that time it had a women's college, Victoria College. So she was quite separate from the men, except when it came to going to the physics lab. And so two things. One was the family moving there, and the second was the fact there was a women's college to go to.
Very good. She was, I think, one of the first women actually to attend McGill. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I read that somewhere.
One of several. One thing that was really, it's funny how these things come around in circles. When we did research, we found that there were two women chemists there at the time, and students, and we just sort of filed that away. And last year we got asked to write on Canadian pioneer women chemists, which has been published in the Canadian Journal of Chemistry. And those two women went over to Germany to continue their education. It's amazing. This is so prevalent that these women, there were no, you couldn't go to Pearson or Trudeau Airport and hop on a plane, go over. You had to get on a ship, and they did this just to get a PhD, because they couldn't get a PhD in Canada. Some of you might have heard of Michaelis-Menten effect in biochemistry, and very few people know it was Maud Menten, a woman scientist. And there's a plaque outside University of Toronto for her.
I think you quoted Ernest Rutherford as saying at one point that, you know, he left Montreal because he considered Canada backwater at the time. That's funny coming from him, since he originated on a sheep farm, I think, in New Zealand.
In New Zealand, yeah.
Yeah, but the other part of this story was interesting. Harriet chose to come back to Montreal at some point after her experience at Cambridge, where you described it as a kind of the atmosphere at Cambridge was, you know, women were actually could contaminate the male atmosphere of the scientific work they were doing there. Did she come back to Montreal because she might have felt more comfortable in Montreal than she did at Cambridge?
Yeah, and also working with Rutherford, because he was very supportive of her. And one of the quotes I didn't get to put in was about how he regarded her as second in importance only to Marie Curie in the obituary he wrote for her in the journal Nature. So he was very, very supportive of her. This is to say, he also had other women students work for him. He was very progressive.
Now, her career in science was voluntarily cut short for all the reasons that you have touched on in your presentation. Do you ever speculate as to what she might have attained had she been able to continue in the sciences?
That's a good question, and so sort of alluded to it, that really she could never have been more than just a research assistant. There was no possibility she would have an actual formal academic position. So yes, she might have got on some more publications, but she would still have experienced the Matilda effect, that Rutherford would have been showered in glory, and she would have been a footnote in history.
I think we should maybe underline that Rutherford did win a Nobel Prize in 1908 for
yes, that's correct. Yeah,
work. Yeah.
But the irony was he got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and he disparaged chemistry, saying that's no more than stamp collecting.
Well, I'm going to ask if anybody has a question for Geoff at this point.
Yeah, I just want to say, everyone, we'll unmute you. So just raise your hand or write in the chat box. Just say, I have a question, or you can type your question in the chat box. I see one from Matthew. And if you don't want to come on camera, we'll read your question on your behalf. Just type it in the chat box. But we'll queue you up. You can also use the reactions, the raise hand if you know where it is on Zoom. If you're on a mobile device, you might have to click your phone once and to make the menu pop up where you can see it. But anyways, let's read this question from Matthew. Matthew, our executive director, Geoff, he's wondering, has she been recognized by McGill in any way?
That's it. I've never really looked into that, but I don't think so. I really not heard of anything. When you look on the different search on Google, you find all these other ways she's been commemorated. But I might be wrong. There might be something, but not that I know of.
I have a kind of a related question. Given her close work with Rutherford over all those years, do we have any sense of whether in his correspondence or in his public speeches, did he make an attempt to highlight her contribution to his work?
Oh yes, yeah. He mentioned it in his address. That was, and also you noticed in that correspondence with Otto Hahn, he mentioned it. But there was another article which I didn't put up, which was where there was a note to Nature, and these notes to Nature, you can only have one author. Well, that time it's all of the, I checked, they're all single author ones, but he stipulated this work was done in collaboration with Miss H.T. Brooks. Now, there's a curious question. What does the T stand for? Because on a birth certificate, there's no T, and yet her publications have a T. Now, one of her ancestors' names was Thompson. That's the only link, but why on her publications, she always called herself H.T. Brooks? That is a puzzle. And if anyone's got any idea where the T comes from, I'd be glad to hear of it.
We have a couple more questions. I'll go to Rod McLeod. Rod, you've put your hand up.
Hey, Rod, you're on.
Thanks. The whole idea that, thanks very much for an interesting talk. I learned a lot. This idea that a woman in a scientific position at this point could never really get any recognition that she deserved, or perhaps any recognition at all, I think is interesting. But it's also interesting how the prospect of marriage effectively barred her career, even in a women's college, which is a whole other sort of level of discrimination, which I think is worth looking at. I've looked a fair amount at normal school, which is obviously a very different level in the 19th century, a little earlier, I guess, than the period that Brooks was active. But looking statistically at all kinds of graduates, it's actually quite remarkable how many of them, the graduates of the McGill Normal School, ended up getting married, or even within a few years. And normal teacher training is a very marketable skill compared to being a physics specialist, even a student, I guess. And yet they did this option, and I think it speaks to I guess a level of sexism that we need to really appreciate, even in relatively recent history, where this business that you can't be married and also married to your work. You can't be a intellectual and residential bigamist, or whatever the phrase might be. So I guess a simple question would be, what was there? One of the research I was doing into normal schools, we made this conclusion that maybe even just training as a teacher makes you an attractive prospect in the marriage market and in the communities in which you might settle, even if you don't actually work. Her husband, the one that she eventually married, you don't paint a very, very attractive picture of him, even though she seems to love him. Was there anything, was he intellectual at all? Was there anything that she might have had an interesting, gone on to, at least, in the evening hours, talked about physics or something with him, or was he just a
not that I know of. I just that speaking to a surviving son, that she was just a great mom, but he always wondered why she had books in Russian on her shelf. And then after her death, what on earth this guy was with a cloak and a gun and one. That was Maxim Gorky. And there's various stories. There was one interesting story that the Andreeva, who's with Maxim Gorky, wanted to go back to Russia to visit her son, but she was likely to get arrested by the Russian secret police. So Harriet Brooks gave her, in those days you didn't have a picture in it, gave her Harriet Brooks's passport so she could go back to Russia, which was quite a brave thing to do, I thought. But it's getting off the topic. I don't think it was a meeting of minds with the Frank Pitcher. I think it was just a case of settling down and having children and raising the children. She gave a talk in Montreal, which is we've put in our book about meeting Marie Curie and her life. So she was speaking to some Montreal club at the time, and she kept the transcript of her presentation. But one of the other things about Rutherford was that the work she did for AMA was not on radioactivity, it was on magnetism. And we found a nice quote by Peter Kapitska saying that when Rutherford took on a new student, he never gave them anything difficult. There's always a problem that could be solved to enhance their self-esteem. And it took us a while to figure out why she didn't do radioactivity, and it was because he wanted her to have a project with a known outcome, making measurements on magnetism, whereas the radioactivity at that stage was just so unknown, no one knew what it was, where it was going.
Geoff, there's a question, another question here up that's been typed into the chat box from Gilles Sabourin. Jill wants to know, who is Josephine McDougall? Her name appears on the same tombstone as Harriet's and the rest of her family. Any idea?
Sorry, could you say it again?
Yeah, the name Josephine McDougall appears on Harriet Brooks's family tombstone, and Gilles Sabourin would like to know, who was she? What relationship to Harriet Brooks did she have? Would you know?
No, don't. No.
Okay.
But I saw the one from Deborah. Sorry, I haven't been monitoring the chat very much. Oh, sorry. Okay, no, I missed that point. It's better to go with open the chat box. The Josephine McDougall is the wife of Paul Brooks Pitcher, so the surviving son. So she's buried in the family plot.
So a daughter-in-law?
Yeah, daughter-in.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
But I like the next one. That's a very good question from Deborah. The family photo is very telling. The eye contact is non-existent and they don't look too happy. I think you're right with that one. I think it was one of these cases where it's like you need to get married and have children, and well, here's a suitor. This is very much Mary Rutherford's point. No one else is going to come along looking for a woman physicist. Grab him while you can.
Geoff, it's Dwayne here again. You mentioned that she lived out her life in Montreal. She spent some years working with Marie Curie in Paris.
Well, no, only briefly. I think it was only briefly, half a year.
A half a year. And she is the discoverer of radon. It is I think it's a fairly radioactive material. Don't know how much she handled these substances, but did she ever suffer the effects of working so closely with materials that we now know are harmful to health?
We're pretty sure she died from the effects of the radiation, because in those days there's absolutely no inkling. Well, it was a little bit, but no real knowledge of the dangers of it. And I forgot what she died of, but certainly can be attributed to the radiation. She died quite young.
Interesting. Rachel Lambie has just posted a question in the chat box. I'll read it quickly for you, Rachel. Are there any other women scientists who have been overlooked to this degree that you might write about? I know that you've
Oh.
written now quite a few books, but you've probably, so that's Rachel's question. Who else who else might you write about?
That's it. I mean, there's hundreds. This is the scary part. There are hundreds of women scientists that have been overlooked. And for example, in more recent times, the discovery of the plate tectonics and the seafloor spreading was actually discovered by Marie Tharp. But she couldn't go out on the research vessels being a woman. So she did the analysis on shore, but it was her boss, Bruce Hazen, who got the credit for it. And Marie Tharp got written out of the story. And then more recently still, there's Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who discovered pulsars, but she got written out of the story, and a supervisor got a Nobel Prize for the discovery. So he never even mentioned her during the Nobel Prize lecture, that she was the one that pestered him and said, there's these little blips on the output. And, oh, it's nothing, just ignore it. It's probably radio noise. No, this is real. And then finally, oh, yeah, hey, that's something new. We call them pulsars. And, Nobel Prize, thank you very much. Oh, someone else discovered it? So there's, so Rachel, there's oodles and oodles, and we've written quite a lot of them. But the other thing is that if you know of any young people who are doing a degree, I'm currently co-teaching a course called Women in Science, which is where we've been uncovering women in science in all the different disciplines from the earliest times up to the mid-20th century. And actually, Rachel, if you send me your email address, I can send you the course syllabus, which has week by week the forgotten women that we cover. We cover typically 5 women a week, and that's just we had difficulty picking 5 sometimes.
Another question from Deborah Nicol Griffith. Does the Nobel Prize Committee ever debate in stating overlooked contributors such as Harriet Brooks?
They did once. It's the only time, and this was about whether or not they should have given an award to Lise Meitner. They opened that up towards the end of the war when they realized it was a gross error. But one of the members of the committee at the time was very anti-women, and he refused to sign off on reopening the Nobel Prize for that year. But the other judges wanted to. That's the only time I know of it.
I don't know much about how the committee works, nothing at all, in fact, but it seems to me that in science in particular, in many fields, the idea of recognizing a single person for a discovery, a new theory that becomes attractive and adopted by many people, that sort of thing, don't we accept that many people contribute to science? I mean, that's how it works. Many people contribute their specialty, their expertise, and today it's not uncommon to find dozens of people's names on papers, even in computer sciences, where we all use applications with dozens and dozens of names of authors. They've all done their own part. So just saying, I wonder if the idea of giving a prize to a single individual makes sense in the sciences in particular, given that it's collaborative by nature.
That's a good question, because there's a very good book called Little Science, Big Science by Derek de Sola Price, which was published quite a while ago on that point, how science has changed now. Something's done in large groups or interacting groups. Oh, one more I should mention that I've forgotten. A forgotten women was Chen Sheng Wu. This was to do with whether or not equal numbers of particles and antiparticles are produced, and 2 male scientists proposed that there was an inequality, but she did the experimental work that showed it was true, and they got the Nobel Prize and she didn't, even though theirs was just speculation and she did the experiment. But coming back to the original point, Yeah, science is now a very different creature to what it was before, and to pick 2 or 3 individuals, that's questionable whether it should still be continued that way. But I think it gives a highlight to science. This is the problem. If you gave it to 50 people at the big nuclear collider, the CERN one, it wouldn't make as big an impact as 4 or 5 people you can get on the morning show.
True enough. Geoff, we're coming to the end of our session now. I just have a few remarks to make before we end our meeting. I'd like to thank your partner, Marelene, if she's watching, also for the work that she's done in documenting the history of women in science. I know she couldn't be with us on the presentation today. Before I close, I would just like to mention to everybody that this talk, the theme of this series of this talk is nominally object history. So we were hoping to, and still will, I'm sure, throughout the series, jog people into their stories by talking about objects that relate to the story that they are telling. And one of the objects, Geoff mentioned it earlier, and which appears in some of the publicity that I sent out for this talk, is this device used in some of the experiments that Harriet Brooks was involved in over 120 years ago at McGill. Unbeknownst to me until recently, there is actually a McGill physics library located on campus where it's open to the public. I think it's by appointment only. So if you're interested in seeing objects from science history from this period, they're all there in the Rutherford collection. And I invite you to check that out on the internet. It seems like a cool place to visit if you're into the museum. Thank you for all of you who joined us today. And thanks to Allison and Glenn for technical support behind the scenes. Very much appreciated. Our next online lecture takes place on January 19th with guest speaker Jean-François Lausier. He is a curator at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, and he's the author of a recent book on Indigenous mission settlements of the St. Lawrence Valley. I hope you will be able to join us. What else can I say? Remember, you have a few minutes left if you want to claim a 30% discount on a Quan membership. You can send your $20 to by Interact transfer to home@q8hn.org. That's using PayPal if you do that, or Interact e-transfer. Please be sure to include your email and your mailing address, whether you are going to send me a chat right now or a messenger by Facebook. Your address is important. And what else can I say? Contact me if you have a question after the broadcast, and I'm sure that my colleagues will be able to contact you later if you'd like to join. That's it, I guess. If you have no more questions, I'm going to say take care. Until next time, be well, stay curious, and we'll see you in the new year on January 19th. Bye-bye.